Welcome back at this look at Visual Studio Code extensions. Last episode, we looked at the basics of creating your own VS Code extension. Now let's jump in and go well beyond that simplistic example that just triggered a message from the command palette and look at a bit more full-featured VS Code extension. Now, what I wanted to do, let's start here by going to the extensions. And what I decided to do one day is I was curious what we had out there for HANA. And sure enough, somebody in the community, once again, had created a nice HANA web IDE editor in Visual Studio Code. And I started looking at this, and it's like, all right, pretty nice. It looks like you make a connection to a HANA database, but then it's got a HANA editor view. And I was like, HANA editor view. That's the old HANA repository. And from the catalog view, if you will, or the HANA database view, it's got a lot of nice functionality. It's got like a SQL console built into it, the ability to execute arbitrary SQL commands via that, but it doesn't understand HDI containers. So it was like, all right, this is part of the way to what I want, but not quite all the way there, since it was very focused on HANA 1.0 repository kind of concepts. So I decided to take a look at the code. As you see here, many VS Code extensions, they link directly to their Git repository that houses them. And I came here, which I love the username you have here, Guitar Sword. I don't believe I know this individual. I haven't really ever interacted with them personally. I don't believe so. But found the project intriguing. Like I said, it had a good foundation conceptually. It was a good example to follow because it already had the tree concepts that I was interested in implementing myself. But it primarily supported tables and, like I said, HANA 1.0 repository concepts. So I really wanted to kind of start with what they had done and build on top of that and adjust things out. The other thing that when I started looking at the source code here, it was all done in TypeScript. And although I've played around with TypeScript some, and actually taking a look at this project this past summer is what caused me to get into more TypeScript development. At the time, I was like, I really prefer regular JavaScript development over TypeScript. So the other thing that I decided to do is I used this as my starting point, but then kind of redeveloped it. I wanted to really redo it from TypeScript to turn it into regular JavaScript. And that was as much an exercise in learning TypeScript, if you will, because it forced me to really go through and learn quite a bit about TypeScript in order to translate it back to JavaScript. So what I want to show you is my little project where I did this, and I have, maybe before we look at the source code, I have it running in my VS Code environment. So I've not published this yet. It's just a little Friday afternoon project when I have a little time to work on it. It's nowhere near finished, and it is a derivative work of what Isaiah has already put out here, but building on top of what he had already done. If we look at this, if I go to the SAP HANA, I've got the tree view, much like the original extension, but now I have the ability to list both HANA systems and connect to HANA systems. As I've done here, I've connected to my HANA Express local system, but you can also make connections to HDI containers as well. And that's what we see here is a connection to an HDI container. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So we see the actual schema name of the container, and I have the ability to create a connection by typing in the connection parameters. You see here where it asks you for the regular host name and port, username, stuff like that. Or I have the ability to create a connection from a default env JSON. The same way that we're using the default env JSON to do local testing and connect to a HANA instance, the HANA CLI uses it. I thought, well, that would be really easy. I could just suck in the default env JSON that's already in my project and then create my HDI container connections from that. That way I'm not having to go and look up the username and password to connect to the container as the runtime user. So the end result is this works very similar to, say, the Database Explorer, but instead of seeing a list of HDI containers from service bindings, I just tell it where my default env JSON is, and then it sucks in the HDI container connection information from there. Now, I've already done that, and I have both my main system connection, which shows me all of my schemas that whatever user I'm logged in as can see. And what you see here is not just the schemas. So this little icon shows you the schemas, but then it actually shows me all the HDI containers that my user is allowed to see. And if I have a user, I'm logged in as system, and I've also made system an HDI admin, and that's why as an HDI admin, I can see these HDI containers as well. So kind of the best of both worlds there, that I have the ability to see schemas and HDI containers, and I only see them once. If they're loaded as an HDI container, then I don't see them as a schema. And likewise, if I want to show the details of a particular HDI container, as I've done here with this BC, and we see it here under the main user as well, but when I see it here, I see all the supporting schemas and other schemas that this runtime container user might be able to see. If I have synonyms set up to go to a foreign schema, I also see those in here as well. So just expanding upon what the original what the original extension was able to do. What else do we see here? Just real quick. Added the ability to look at views as well. No views in this particular example. Added system information. I also didn't change a whole lot else, but for instance here, when we look at the tables, let's just look here at go to S-Flight table. We see the data types, key values, lengths of each column. We have the ability to, say, select records. That opens a select from that table in the little SQL console here, if you will. And if we hit F8, the results open here in another view. Now, one of the things that I have changed from the original extension is I changed the visualization that I'm using here, or the tool that I'm using to do the visualization of the output of SQL commands. That's what allows the sorting of the columns here. So that was a deviation as well from the original extension. But, you're getting an idea here of the scope of this particular extension. We have the visualization of connections, tables, views, details that can be displayed, a SQL console. This is pretty full-featured. So this is going to allow us to really showcase what all can be developed here using a Visual Studio Code extension. And although we don't have time to go through all the details of it, we're going to see quite a few good examples. All right, let's start looking at the code of this example. And once again, we're not going to take the time to look at every bit of the code, but I want to give you enough of a sense using this as an example of, well, really just how easy it is to build an extension that's pretty full-featured here. It's got a lot of different functionality and interaction with the overall Visual Studio Code environment. Yet at its heart, it's not really fundamentally all that much different than what we saw in episode 2 with the very simple Hello World kind of extension. Now, just like we started there with the package JSON, we'll do the same here in this example. And fundamentally, starts off very similar, but what we see here, we have in the contribute section where most of the hooks into the UI are defined. We see, first of all, the activity bar. This little section right here, this is exactly what adds our icon to this left-hand section. This is the activity bar. And just by giving it a unique ID, a title, and an icon, that's what, when we install this VS Code extension, we'll add it right here. So very easy to hook things into this left-hand activity bar. Next, we see a series of commands. And what we're going to do first is we're going to just define all the possible commands. The command key and the title, an icon if there is one, and then a category that allows us to group commands together. But so far, everything we define in this command section is the possible commands we're going to want, but we haven't tied them anywhere into our user interface. In the next section, we get into how we tie these commands to the specific parts of the user interface. And we can take the single command and tie it to different things. For instance, we have the command SAP HANA execute query tied to a key binding, but we're going to have the same command, SAP HANA execute query, tied to the command palette and to the context menu, as we'll see here in a minute. What this allows us to do is define our commands independent of where and how they are triggered in the user interface. And that way we only have a single event handler that will be executed regardless of how that particular command is triggered in the user interface. This keeps us from having to deal with different places that the command could be triggered, and really focus just on writing the logic to handle the events when they occur without having to worry about how they fit into the larger user interface here of Visual Studio Code. This is really nice and frees up our coding, as I said, to focus on the events and what we want to do in those events. And really our complete user interface is being built up here. For instance, the key binding execute query will happen when somebody hits the F8 key, but only when the editor type is set to SQL. So what we see here is if I come back over to this extension, and I come here to SFlight, and let's go ahead and select records. This opens the SQL console, if you will, and you can see the editor type is SQL. Therefore, when I hit F8, it responds and opens the data preview here. But if we see the same execute query is also attached to the command palette, so if I come over here and I have the SQL editor open and I come to the command palette and I say HANA, then there's also the execute query linked here as well. But that only shows up in the command palette if this particular editor type is displayed. If instead package.json is displayed and I go to the command palette and I narrow my list to HANA commands, it's no longer listed there, right? So we get this very intelligent, context-aware triggering of what's possible in the command palette. And we don't have to write any code to make that happen. It's simply based upon this definition and the when condition that we add into each of these definitions in the package.json that's controlling all of this for us. Visual Studio Code is going to read all this definition and metadata about our extension when it's loaded, and then it takes care of all of this. The hooks into the command palette, the hooks into the key bindings, the hooks into the context menu. You see here, if I do a right mouse click context menu inside the SQL editor, I get this execute query, F8, that I don't have in any, well, if I can switch my, that I don't have in my other editor. So now we're seeing in our extensions how we can not only add things to the command palette, but we can add key commands and context menu commands, but for specific editors or editors that are bound to specific syntax. That's really what we're doing. We're not even saying a particular editor, but we're saying when that editor language ID is equal to SQL. So it's the type that we have. So we're tying things to certain language modes, and then the user can choose what language they want per file extension or editor type. So we're really giving a lot of power back to our end user there as well. Now, likewise, we see other commands here: filter tables, filter schemas. We also have the ability to put commands on the context as well of a particular view. So if I come up here to the system view and I do the context menu, well, then I'm getting connected database, delete database, refresh system info. But if I come down here to a particular table, then all I see is refresh. Or I come to a schema, I see filter tables. If I come here, select records, so it's very context aware. Now, what we're setting up here is we're saying when certain views are visible. So we could have multiple views over here as well. In our instance, the way I've changed this original extension, it had multiple views because it had like the repository view. I didn't need that. I cut this down to just one view. But I have a lot of logic still based upon what kind of view item, whether it's a connection, a database, a table, and all these types are going to be different node types that I'm going to put in the tree. So I have the ability to respond with different context menus based upon what level of and what type of node that I'm right mouse clicking on. Once again, all that is defined here in the package JSON. Later, when we get into the code, you won't see any if checks, when conditions, having to check the UI state, or any of that. It's all defined and triggered by VSCode. Once again, all I have to do is worry about event handlers and building my tree structure and injecting different nodes into that tree structure. So two main things I'm going to do in code, and we're going to look at both of those now as well. So what we see here is just like in our hello world example. If we scroll back up, we have a main, that's our entry point. Now, I did convert this from TypeScript to JavaScript, so my entry point is now this extension.js. Let's go back over to the project and let's look at extension.js. Now, there's a little bit more code here on activate. Now, that's your entry point to all of your execution. That's what triggers when your extension is activated upon loading of Visual Studio itself. It's going to go through its list and it's going to activate each of the extensions individually. And they do lazy load. The overall VS Code environment initializes, and then it loads the extensions asynchronously in the background after that initial startup. Now we're going to have some things here to record the state, to record the connection information, the connection parameters. I'm not necessarily going to go into all that. I want to focus more on the interesting parts that are specific to the visualization of the extension here. And that's really going to be, just like in our little hello world, we're going to register commands, some key commands like create connection from JSON, use connection, delete connection, and execute query. These are the main things that can happen in our application, our extension, as we've seen. And we're just having to subscribe to those events. Once again here, remember our execute query, that can be triggered by command palette, that can be triggered by F8, it can be triggered by context menu, but it doesn't matter to our coding. All we know is that we're subscribing to when the command execute query happens. Here's the event handler that we want to trigger. And from here we can do the logic, however we need to. In my case, when we do execute query, well, do we have an active connection to a HANA database? So there has to be a valid connection here. If there isn't any connections created, or if I don't have one highlighted, then it won't do anything. First of all, because if there's no connection, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to show an info message down on the bottom of the screen, no connection to database, right? Well, if there is a connection, then I want to get the active editor window. because I know this command can only be triggered when an editor is open with type SQL. So I want to get the current editor. Well, if I can't get the editor, I'm just going to exit out. Something's horribly wrong, but no reason to issue a message. And then we want to make sure that the editor is not empty. And as long as it's not empty, then we go ahead and get the text. Or if the editor selection, if the editor selection is empty, then we go ahead and get the whole document. But if there was a selection, so let's say I select just part of the document, just like in the SQL console in Database Explorer and in the HANA Studio, if we have just a sub-selection here, then we want to execute just that. Now, that wasn't a complete SQL statement, so I got a SQL syntax error, incorrect syntax near from, because I only sent a part of my statement in. But if I do something here like, I don't know, select current user from dummy, and I select just that portion, and I do an F8, then it executed just that one SQL statement. So that's all that we need in our logic to make that work, is we say if the selection is empty, then get the whole document. Otherwise, we say get text, but just editor selection. And this is where Visual Studio has made creating extensions so easy. It's these APIs that are exposed via the VSCode object that gives us access to things like the current editor and the context and things like that. We're not having to do a lot of complicated coding to get access to the context of where we're in, nor is it very difficult to get user input. So, for instance, if we've got a connection without a database name, so we've got a connection to the database, but we don't know the tenant that it's for, then we can pop up and say VSCode Windows show input box and ask for the tenant. Now we're saying, okay, HANADB, execute query. Well, HANADB, if we roll back up, it's a little utility library that I've coded elsewhere in the code just to pull out the SQL commands so that they're all centralized. But what we see here is very, very easy way of interacting with the overall user interface, right? Now, the other thing that we have going on here is we need to build the tree, obviously. And what we've got here is we've got views. We've got two different views for the SQL results view, where when I do execute this, when I hit F8, this is the SQL results view that shows the output. And we've got a view here that is this navigation pane, this tree. Those are the only two views that we have in our extension. Everything else comes from standard, and those are part of the extension. But let's look at the code for each of these now real quick. Let's start here with the SQL results view. So we look here at our view, SQL results view. This one is the simplest one because it's rather standalone. So we say, yes, SQL results view. We want to show data and a title. So we're just able to, once again, using the VS Code APIs, we're saying VS Code window, create web view panel. So we're creating like a little web browser in place inside of VS Code. And we're telling it, we're doing some formatting, we're setting a title, but then enable scripting, yes. And we're saying the inner HTML of that web view, set it to, and we have this build table. This is just, I put it in a little utility library off to the side to keep the code clean, but it's going to build the HTML that we're going to inject into the page. And if we look at the utility and we look at HTML, not a whole lot going on here. Basically, I'm using a jQuery library. I found this tabulator visualization where I could just give it JSON data and it would visualize it in a nice table with column definitions and layouting and the sorting, all that's being taken care of by this library. So I did not build this as a native Visual Studio Code user interface element. I'm building this as HTML and then just injecting the HTML into that control, and it's displaying in place, and it's interactive. So that's one nice way to extend things. Now let's look at the other major view, which is the tree provider. And what we have here is the tree provider. Well, this is the root of our tree, right? This is our main UI element. And we're going to have connections, and then we're going to have schemas or HDI containers, and then within there we're going to have tables, or we're going to have views, and we list each table, and a table has columns. So what we need to do here is get the root tree items, which are going to be defined here in the root of the view, but then we can, which is going to be connection nodes. So that's what we're going to have here. Return get connection nodes. And connection nodes, the logic is right here in the main view. So we're basically going to look up, are there any stored connections? If there are connections, then basically we pull out the details of that connection, and we build a connection node. And that's really, now everything else, because this is the root node, everything else then runs as nodes in my model folder. So our main UI, not a whole lot to it, just the initialization of the tree. Everything else is really, other than the reusable utilities, which have some constants, the HANA database connection. This is just where I build my HANA database queries. So nothing too special going on there. We've already seen the HTML one. And then I have this storage. This is mostly from the original extension. I've only done a few minor extensions to it to store some additional properties. But for the most part, all the logic was in the original extension that I was using as my starting point, that has all the persistence in secure storage in VS Code to store the connection parameters and their states and things like that. The rest of this extension, we've really seen almost all the extension now. The rest of it is really just the models. And what you have here for the model is column nodes, connection nodes, database nodes, table nodes, and type nodes. And that corresponds to the different node types that we've seen here. Connection nodes, schema, tables, views. So we start here with the connection node. That's at the root. And a connection node can, of course, have children of a database node. But this is going to be really the logic to build the connection. Once again, like here's the name of the connection, the icon, whether it's active or inactive. So all that is being set here. We see that's our active connection. It's got the little green pipe on it, as opposed to this one being the active connection. We can switch by saying connect to database. That's going to control which one is our current active connection for, like when we do the F8s in the SQL window. And then we have the search capability, because at this level we can filter to only show certain things. So all that logic is built in here. And if it's an active connection, well, now we got to go retrieve all the schemas. So we already load the data that we want for the next level of the tree. And then for each record, for instance, here, we're going to get all the schemas. So this is the logic to go read from the HANA database and either get schemas, or in this case, get the containers as well. We're reading from the container names. And we execute the query. And then for each item, we're going to return that in this get schemas. So then when we get the children, so initially all that's rendered by Visual Studio Code is the root nodes. And then when I expand one of the root nodes, that's going to call the get children event handler. The get children will then trigger get schemas for whatever the current selected node is. and then it will return this map that's basically going to pass the connection information, so the current connection, and the item that has been looked up, as we loop through the list of schemas, and it's going to create a new database node. Now, this was called database node. I think that was a holdover from the original extension. I didn't go through and rename all the node types, but that's going to serve as the node that renders either my schemas or my containers, right? So that's the database node. And then we also have some logic here for like the event handler of the get system info. That's implemented actually here. All we're doing is selecting from M system overview, and then we're rendering that by creating the web view panel. We can delete the connections, edit the connections. It's all pretty straightforward. But now we want to look at our database node. So that's the next one that we visualize. There's our database node. All right, so each instance right here, keep hitting the wrong button. Each instance, each schema, then is an instance of this class. So we've exposed the class database node, and each one of these behind here logically, at runtime, if we look at the debuggers, we're just creating an array of instances of this class, of this database node class for each item that appears in our tree. And, it's got certain properties that are attached to it, certain event handlers like set search text. But for the most part, the get tree item is going to render this item. So not a whole lot of logic here. If it's not a container, then we use the schema.gif. If it is a container, then we use the database.png. That's how we're setting the different icons for the different levels or the different types on this node. But then once again, we've got an event handler get children that will be triggered when we expand one of these. So we only are firing the event handlers on explode. So it's like lazy loading the next set of data. It's not pre-building the whole tree structure. So it's very efficient. But so this event handler get children would fire. And what it's going to do is, performing the query to go get tables and views. This one's simple because we're not actually going and looking up the tables and views at this level. We're just hard coding these elements. And if tomorrow I add a new one, say store procedures as well, I would just add a node for store procedures. So this is like a hard coded node, right? So it's not till I really expand tables that I get the specific table elements. So now instead of database, now we've got a table node, right? And the table node will list the table. This is all pretty straightforward. But then we're going to get columns of that table, right? So once again, the get children will fire when I expand a table, and then it will go get all the columns for whatever table was expanded. It will map those, and it will create a column node, right? For each of the columns that it finds. And we go back to our coding. Then we have the column node. And here's the column node. Gets the tree item to render this particular column node. And there are no children. So we simply return nothing there, right? And that's how it knows. That's how it knows not to give us another arrow to expand, because there's nothing a level below this, right? All right, so I know that's a pretty big example to throw at you, but a pretty realistic one, a pretty expansive one, and it's allowed us to show a lot of different techniques. We've seen how we can enhance a particular editor. We can add to the command palette. We can add to the context menu. We can add visualizations both into the editor area, but also into the navigation area over here. How we can build a navigation tree and have events and interactivity triggered off that tree. And we did it all in the context of an SAP use case, a HANA Database Explorer-like extension. So I hope you found that useful, and perhaps considering building your own extensions in the future. maybe even as part of Devtoberfest. It would be a great idea if you have something that you really want in the development environment that you work in, as many community members have already done. Once again, we'll come back here and we'll look at some of these that I have installed, like the ABOP extension written by Lars, ABOP CDS support, ABOP remote file system. And look, each of these have different community member names on them, different publishers. So just in a few of the ABOP ones that I have installed here, you see different people contributing to these. It's really great. You could contribute as well. You see, it's relatively simple to build your own VS Code extensions. There are some good tutorials to help you get started. As we've seen here with the HANA, most all these extensions, you can go and look at the source code of how people built them. It's a great way to learn as well. And largely, if there's something you want to do, go look at how somebody did something similar, maybe in a different language, in a different syntax, whatever. There's some great examples out there. You can build upon those, extend those to your particular environment, your particular use case. There's a whole endless list of possibilities here to extend the development environment that we're using here using VS Code extensions. And I hope you enjoyed this foray into VS Code extensions and have found it useful, and consider maybe building your own in the future.